in the shadowed halls of vanished empires, where marble once gleamed under the weight of conquest. The true architect of ruin was rarely the barbarian at the gate. It was the endless march of armies, the ceaseless roar of cannons, and the silent hemorrhage of treasure that no vault could contain. Picture the year 1575 in the Spanish court of Philip II, where golden galleons from the New World docked in Seville, their hulls heavy with silver from Potosi. Yet behind the splendor, accountants whispered of debts that multiplied like locusts. Empires do not fall in a single battle. They bleed out over decades of war, each campaign a promise of glory that demanded payment in coin, blood, and stability. This is the story of wars that bankrupted empires, a hidden ledger of ambition that turned the mightiest realms into hollow monuments. The collapse did not begin with chaos. It began quietly, in the flickering light of candles burning late over war maps drawn in royal chambers. For centuries, the Roman Empire stood as the unassailable colossus of the ancient world. Its legions carving roads through forests and deserts, its aqueducts carrying water to thriving cities from Britannia to Judea. Daily life under the Pax Romana hummed with routine certainty. Merchants haggled in bustling forums, scented with spices from the east. Farmers tilled fields protected by frontier forts, and senators debated in marble halls while slaves carried messages across vast provinces. The empire's wealth flowed from tribute and trade, but its backbone was military. Soldiers received regular pay, veterans were granted land, and borders were secured through constant vigilance. Families in provincial towns celebrated victories with feasts, believing the legions invincible. The air carried the scent of olive groves and incense, the sounds of marching boots a reassuring rhythm rather than a threat. Yet beneath this ordered existence, the machinery of expansion was already straining. No one understood what was coming next, as the cost of maintaining such a vast domain began to erode the very foundations that held it together. Early invisible warning signs appeared in the form of stretched supply lines and rising military expenditures. In Rome, emperors like Trajan pushed deep into Dacia and Mesopotamia, returning with treasures that briefly masked the growing burden. Taxes climbed gradually on citizens and provinces alike, justified as necessary for defense. Local governors reported increasing difficulty collecting levies, as farmers struggled under the weight of supporting distant campaigns. The treasury, once overflowing from conquests, now relied on debasing currency, mixing lesser metals into coins that lost value almost overnight. Merchants noticed inflation creeping into markets, where a loaf of bread cost more each season. In frontier forts, soldiers waited longer for pay, their loyalty tested by empty promises. These were not dramatic events but subtle fractures, the kind historians later trace with the benefit of ruined ledgers and abandoned villas. The empire's daily rhythm continued, but an undercurrent of unease settled over the provinces, where whispers of discontent replaced open celebration. As the 3rd century dawned, rising tension and instability became impossible to ignore. Barbarian incursions along the Rhine and Danube intensified, forcing emperors to deploy larger armies for longer periods. Civil wars erupted as generals turned on each other, each claiming the purple amid economic strain. The crisis of the 3rd century saw over 20 emperors in 50 years, many assassinated by their own troops demanding back pay. Provinces suffered raids that burned granaries and disrupted trade routes. In cities like Antioch and Milan, once vibrant centers, food shortages sparked riots, while officials imposed emergency taxes to fund endless repairs to broken defenses. The air filled with the smoke of burning fields and the distant clash of steel. Merchants closed shops earlier, families hoarded grain, and the great roads that once unified the empire now carried more refugees than legionaries. The pressure of perpetual warfare transformed the Roman state into a machine devouring its own resources, where every victory came at a price that weakened the whole. Key decisions sealed the fate of these ancient powers. Diocletian and later Constantine attempted reforms, splitting the empire and creating new administrative burdens to sustain military payrolls. Massive building projects for new capitals drained what remained of the treasury. In the West, reliance on barbarian mercenaries grew as Roman citizens avoided service, further eroding central control. Each emperor faced the same impossible choice: continue fighting to preserve borders or risk immediate fragmentation. Mistakes compounded when resources were diverted from infrastructure to frontier wars, leaving roads crumbling and aqueducts unrepaired. The pressure of maintaining an army larger than the productive economy could support created a vicious cycle. Taxes became confiscatory, driving landowners to abandon estates. By the late 4th century, the Western Empire's financial arteries were severed. Its ability to project power a fading memory even as rituals of imperial glory persisted in Ravenna and Rome. The moment the system began to fail arrived not with a single sack, but through cascading bankruptcies of will and wealth. In 476, the last Western emperor was deposed, but the true rupture had come decades earlier, when the treasury could no longer sustain the legions. Cities emptied as populations fled taxation and conscription. Trade networks collapsed, and coinage lost all trust, forcing barter economies to emerge in the shadows of once great forums. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind through abandoned colonnades. What had been the engine of civilization now ground to a halt, its fuel exhausted by centuries of martial ambition. Similar patterns echoed across time. The Spanish Empire under the Habsburgs faced parallel ruin in the 16th and 17th centuries, declaring bankruptcy multiple times, despite fleets of silver from the Americas. Wars in the Netherlands, against England, and in the Holy Roman Empire consumed resources faster than colonies could replenish them. Philip II's grand strategy of Catholic supremacy through arms proved financially unsustainable, leading to mutinies among unpaid troops and economic stagnation at home. Human consequences and social breakdown followed swiftly in the wake of these financial implosions. In Roman provinces, once prosperous villas fell into disrepair as owners could no longer afford maintenance or protection. Banditry surged along trade routes, while famine and disease exploited weakened populations. Families were torn apart by conscription, with mothers watching sons march off to distant frontiers from which few returned. In Spanish territories, the burden of war taxes sparked revolts in Catalonia and Portugal, fracturing the empire's unity. Peasants in Castile faced starvation as grain was requisitioned for armies fighting in Flanders. The streets of Madrid echoed with the complaints of merchants ruined by inflation and interrupted commerce. Fear replaced routine, as the certainty of daily life dissolved into uncertainty. Children grew up knowing only stories of past glory, while the present offered only hardship and the distant thunder of conflict. Social bonds frayed, trust and authority evaporated, and entire classes disappeared into poverty or migration, leaving ruins that still whisper of former grandeur. The long-term historical impact of these wars stretched far beyond the immediate collapses. The fall of Rome reshaped Europe, birthing feudal kingdoms from its fragments and altering the course of law, language, and religion for a millennium. The vacuum invited new powers and migrations that redrew the map of the continent. Similarly, Spain's bankruptcy and overextension after decades of conflict accelerated the rise of England, France, and the Dutch Republic, shifting global power toward Northern Europe and the Atlantic. Empires learned bitter lessons about the limits of military ambition, though few truly internalized them. The wealth extracted through conquest often funded further wars rather than sustainable growth, creating cycles of boom and ruin. These events demonstrated how the pursuit of dominance through arms could hollow out even the richest societies, turning gold into lead and glory into debt. The world that emerged was one where smaller, more agile states sometimes outmaneuvered exhausted giants, forever changing the balance of civilization. Yet the echoes of these bankrupted empires linger in our modern age, where the costs of conflict continue to mount in ledgers both visible and hidden. From the ruins of aqueducts in North Africa to the silent shipyards of Seville, the evidence remains. What begins as strategic necessity often evolves into existential burden, draining treasuries until governance itself becomes impossible. The silence that settles over fallen capitals carries a warning carried on the wind. Empires rise on the promise of victory, but they fall when the price of endless war exceeds the value of any prize. In that quiet space between triumph and exhaustion lies the true nature of power, fragile and fleeting. As we gaze upon these broken monuments, one truth endures through the ages. The most devastating defeats are not always delivered by enemies, but by the wars fought in the name of survival that ultimately consume the survivor. The collapse did not announce itself with fanfare. It arrived gradually, invoice by unpaid invoice, until nothing remained but memory and stone.